There are men who get burned once and learn. There are men who get burned twice and learn slowly. And then there are men like Jasper Riley, who got burned twice on two different continents, swore on everything he had left that he was done, flew 10,000 kilometers to start fresh, and walked directly into the same fire wearing a different face. He was 75 years old. He had two failed marriages behind him. He had a number, $430,000, that he cannot say out loud without his jaw tightening. And he had a question he couldn't stop asking himself, even in the quiet of the mornings, even when the fan was running and the street outside was still, and he had nowhere to be and no one to answer to. How does a man who already knows the ending keep reading the same story? This is what he found out. The morning I understood what had happened, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my flat in Quezon City with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a bank statement that hadn't. 3 pages. Figures in a column, transfers, withdrawals, a pattern so clean it looked almost accidental if you didn't know what you were looking at. But I knew I'd seen a version of this before. Twice, in fact. Once in a terrace house in Salford when I was 43, and once in a semi-detached in Didsbury when I was 61. The amounts had been different. The women had been different. The paperwork had looked almost exactly the same. $430,000 gone in 16 months. And the woman who had taken it, Amber Villagas, 34 years old, administrator at a property management company in Quezon City, smile like a slow sunrise and a patience for long games that I had mistaken, again for kindness, was not answering her phone. I sat there for a long time, not crying. I'm past the age where this kind of thing makes me cry. What I felt was something closer to a specific, quiet disgust, not at Amber, not entirely, but at the version of myself that had let this happen again, who had seen the early signs and blinked and looked away and told himself this time was different, because that's what I always do. That's what I have always done. And at 75 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in the Philippines with cold tea and an empty account, I had finally run out of the ability to pretend I didn't know it. Let me tell you about the pattern, because that's what this story is really about, not Amber specifically. The pattern. I was married the first time at 38 to a woman named Sandra. I had been managing a distribution depot in Manchester for 12 years by then, working long hours, the kind of hours that feel necessary when you're building something and feel pointless when you look back at them 30 years later. Sandra was the office manager at a firm our depot contracted with. Sharp, efficient, charming in a way that felt like a reward after a long day. We married 18 months after we met. The first year was good. The second was harder. By the third, she had found a solicitor, and I had found out that a significant portion of what we'd built together had been managed quietly and systematically in ways that left me with less than I'd thought. The divorce cost me substantially, not devastatingly. I was young enough to recover financially, but the emotional accounting was worse than the financial one. I told myself I'd learned something. I told myself that for 11 years, long enough to half believe it. Then I met Caroline. I was 59, she was 44, and she came into my life through a mutual friend at a dinner party in Coralton. She was a project coordinator, good with logistics and timelines, which I found attractive because those are qualities I respect. We were together for 2 years before we married, which I thought was the lesson I'd learned from Sandra. Take more time, go slower, be sure. The marriage lasted 4 years. The pattern was similar enough to the first that I resurfaced that I remember sitting in my solicitor's office the second time, listening to the settlement terms, thinking, how did I not see this coming? And the answer, which I did not want to face, was that I had seen it coming. I had seen the small signs, the financial decisions that bypassed me, the gradual shift in who controlled what, the way certain conversations were deflected with warmth rather than answered. I had seen all of it. I had just chosen each time to believe the comfortable explanation rather than the accurate one. The second divorce finalized when I was 67. I walked out of my solicitor's office in Manchester city centre on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and I stood on the pavement and I said out loud, to nobody in particular, never again. I meant it. I genuinely meant it. I retired properly at 69, sold the house in Didsbury, which still had equity despite everything, and moved into a rented flat in the northern quarter while I figured out what came next. What came next, after about 8 months of gray skies and quiet evenings, and the particular loneliness of a man who has spent his entire life surrounded by activity and is now facing its absence, was the Philippines. A colleague who'd retired there 2 years earlier had been sending me photographs. Sunlight, markets, color, a cost of living that meant my pension and savings could buy a decent life rather than a managed one. I booked a 3-week trip, extended it to 6, came back to Manchester, sold most of what was left, and moved. I want to be precise about my state of mind when I arrived in Quezon City at 73. I was not looking for a relationship. That is not something I am saying now to sound less foolish. It is genuinely true. I had made a private and firm decision that that part of my life was over, and I had made peace with it in the way that you make peace with something when the alternative has cost you enough times. I was there for the weather and the cost and the noise and the sense of being somewhere that asked different things of me than Manchester had been asking. I was not looking for a woman, which is, of course, precisely when they find you. I met Amber Villagas at a building management office in the complex where I'd rented my flat. She was the administrator. I needed to sort out a problem with my internet connection and the utility setup, standard new arrival complications, and she was the person behind the desk who handled it, efficiently as it turned out. She made 3 phone calls, resolved the issue in 40 minutes, and apologized for the inconvenience in a way that felt genuinely rather than professionally sorry about it. These setups always take longer than they should for new residents, she said. I'll follow up tomorrow to make sure it's all working properly. She did follow up. The next morning, a text message to the number I'd given for the account. Everything confirmed. Please let me know if there are any further issues. Polite, professional, nothing to notice. But she had a quality I've since identified as one of the specific things I'm vulnerable to. She was competent, visibly, demonstrably competent, the kind of person who does what they say they will do, who follows through on small things, who manages details carefully. I've spent 40 years in management, and I know the value of that quality because it's rarer than it should be. I respond to it with an instinctive trust that I've never learned to properly interrogate. The second interaction was 2 weeks later, a question about the building's maintenance schedule. The third, a passing conversation near the car park. The fourth time we spoke at length was when she mentioned, in what felt like a natural aside, that she sometimes helped new foreign residents navigate the local bureaucracy, utility registrations, medical facilities, the best local markets because the area could be confusing to someone unfamiliar with it. I don't want anything for it, she said, when I started to respond. It's just useful to know someone who knows the city. I remember how lost I felt when I first moved here from my province. We had lunch the following Saturday. She recommended a local place, nothing expensive, and she talked about her background with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who wasn't performing their life story, but simply answering questions honestly. She'd grown up in Pampanga, moved to Quezon City for work in her mid-20s. She was currently supporting her younger brother through a technical course and sending money home to her parents monthly, the kind of quiet filial obligation that is simply part of life here and that she mentioned without drama or complaint. She had a small circle of close friends and didn't go out much. She found her work meaningful because she was good at it. You seem very settled, I said. I've had to be, she said. There wasn't always someone else to rely on. I noticed something in myself when she said that. A recognition, because I understand what it means to be a person who relies on themselves, who has had to become self-contained out of necessity. I'd been that person since my second divorce. And when you recognize something in another person that you understand from the inside, you feel less alone in a way that is very hard to resist. We saw each other again the following weekend, and the one after that. By the end of the second month, we were having dinner together 2 or 3 evenings a week, and I had stopped examining this development particularly carefully because it had arrived so gradually and naturally that it didn't feel like a decision I'd made. It felt like something that had simply become true. I told myself it was friendship. I told myself that for about 6 weeks longer than I actually believed it. Here is the thing about patterns. They don't repeat exactly. If they repeated exactly, you'd recognize them immediately and stop. What they do is repeat in theme, the same underlying structure, the same emotional mechanism, but with enough surface variation that each version feels new. Sandra had been sharp-tongued and overtly capable. Caroline had been warm and socially skilled. Amber was quiet and competent and self-reliant, which is a different packaging entirely from either of my ex-wives. And my brain treated it as a different thing. My brain was wrong. The underlying mechanism was the same. Find what a man responds to. Become that thing. Build his trust slowly and thoroughly. Then begin. The first time Amber mentioned a financial difficulty, I almost didn't register it as significant. We'd been seeing each other for about 4 months. It was a casual mention. The building where her brother was taking his technical course had increased the term fees unexpectedly. He was 2 weeks from completing the course and at risk of losing his place. She wasn't asking me anything. She mentioned it the way you mention a frustrating situation to someone you trust, which is to say, without a request attached. Just the information. How much is the shortfall? I asked. Please don't, she said immediately. It's not your problem. I'm not saying it's my problem. I'm asking how much. She told me. It wasn't a large sum. I said I'd transfer it. She declined twice and accepted on the third. That sequence, the mention without asking, the immediate refusal, the reluctant acceptance, is a sequence I can now see with the absolute clarity of someone who has watched the same film 3 times and finally understands the editing. But at the time, the reluctance felt genuine, which is what made the acceptance feel generous on my part rather than orchestrated on hers. Over the following months, the requests came in a rhythm I can map precisely now, looking back at the records. never two in quick succession, never large enough individually to provoke a serious conversation. Her mother's health check, a blood test, and consultation that the rural clinic couldn't handle, a roof repair at her parents' house in Pampanga. She showed me photographs of the damage, water staining on ceiling boards, and she'd taken those photographs herself on a recent visit home, which made it feel immediate and real. Her brother again, a certification exam with a registration fee, each one small, each one with a story attached that felt specific and verifiable, each one prefaced with reluctance and followed by genuine seeming gratitude. I was transferring money to her about once every 3 to 4 weeks. I was not adding up the total. This is the specific failure I cannot explain satisfactorily because as a retired depot manager, I am a man who has spent his professional life tracking numbers. But in the context of the relationship, I had separated the financial transactions from the financial picture in a way that I've since discussed at length with a counselor here and still don't fully understand. The individual amounts felt manageable. The cumulative amount was catastrophic, and I did not look at them cumulatively for 16 months. What changed that habit was a phone call from my daughter, Gemma. Gemma is 44 years old and lives in Leeds with her husband and 2 teenagers. She is the child of my first marriage, though Sandra and I share that description awkwardly, and she has been carefully, lovingly suspicious of my choices in women since she was about 15 years old and watched her mother manage the household finances in ways that didn't add up. She called me on a Sunday evening in October, Manila time, which meant it was mid-morning in Leeds, and she said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. When have I ever been dishonest with you?" "That's not a no," she said. I told her about Amber. I'd been planning to tell her at some point. I simply kept finding reasons to wait. Gemma listened in the particular silence she uses when she is absorbing something and making simultaneous calculations. "How much have you given her?" she asked when I finished. "It's not like that," I said. "It's been, Dad, how much?" I didn't know the exact figure. I told her that, and I could feel the weight of the silence that followed. "Go and look," she said. "Right now. Pull up the transfers and add them up." "I'll wait." I told her I'd call her back. I sat down at my laptop and opened the accounts and began going through the history and the process of adding up those figures. Not individually, the way I'd been experiencing them, but in sequence, as a list, as a total, was one of the more quietly terrible experiences of my adult life, because the number that emerged was not what I had been telling myself, loosely, that I'd been spending. The number was much larger. It had been growing in the dark while I looked at each piece separately and told myself it was fine. I called Gemma back. "How much?" she said. I told her. Her silence lasted longer this time. "Dad," she said finally. Her voice was controlled. She was making an effort with it. "This is what happened with Mum and with Caroline. Do you understand that? This is different," I said. And I heard myself saying it, and I recognized it immediately. Not in the moment. I want to be accurate. I didn't fully recognize it in the moment, but within about 30 seconds of saying it, I heard the echo of every other time I had said exactly those words. This is different. The phrase I use when the evidence isn't in front of me and I choose the comfortable alternative. "In what way is it different?" Gemma asked. She wasn't being cruel. She was being precise. "Tell me one specific way." I couldn't. We stayed on the phone for a long time. She didn't tell me what to do. She knows better than to tell me what to do We've had that argument, and she won it by stopping, but she asked me to look at the transfers again, to go back further, to look at the pattern of timing rather than just the amounts. So I did, and what I saw when I looked at the timing was something that the amounts alone had obscured. The requests had been accelerating, slowly, carefully. The intervals between them had shortened over the past 6 months. What had started as once every 3 to 4 weeks had become once every 10 to 12 days. The amounts per request had also risen incrementally. Not dramatically, never dramatically, but rising, like a tide that moves so slowly you don't notice until your feet are wet. I put the phone down and I sat in the quiet of the flat and I let myself look at what I was looking at. I'd told myself this was different. I'd told myself that twice before. The differences I'd identified: Amber's self-reliance, her competence, her apparent lack of material ambition, the way she consistently declined before accepting, were surface differences. The mechanism underneath was the same one I'd lived through twice already in 2 Manchester marriages. I was 75 years old, and I had spent 16 months in the same trap for the 3rd time. The feeling that arrived wasn't rage. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was something more like a very cold recognition, the feeling of a man who has finally stopped making excuses for himself long enough to see himself clearly and doesn't particularly like what he sees. I didn't confront Amber immediately. I want to be honest about why. Partly because I needed time to verify what I suspected, and partly because there was still a part of me, still, even then, even looking at the numbers, that wanted there to be an explanation. That part of me is apparently unkillable. It has survived 2 divorces and a lifetime of evidence, and it still shows up quietly, suggesting that maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's something I've missed, maybe the numbers look worse than they are because I'm distressed. I spent 4 days going through everything carefully. The total came to $430,000 across 16 months. This included direct transfers to her account, a joint purchase of a car she'd said she needed for work that was registered in her name, a loan to her brother that had been described as temporary, the down payment on a property she'd shown me photographs of in Pampanga, an investment, she'd said, something that would appreciate, something we could both benefit from. I had agreed to that because I believed, by the time it was proposed, that we had a future of a kind that justified a shared investment. There was no property. I checked. The address she'd given me corresponded to a real street, and the photographs she'd shown me were real photographs. I found the original listing on a real estate website, a property that had been for sale and then sold to someone else 8 months earlier. She had shown me photographs of a property someone else now owned. The money I'd given her for it had gone into her account and out again in a pattern consistent with everything else. On the 5th day, I called her. She answered on the 2nd ring, which surprised me. I had half expected to reach voicemail. "Jasper," she said warmly, "I was going to message you tonight. Are you free for dinner tomorrow? There's a new place near the compound I've been wanting to try." "I've been looking at the bank records," I said. A pause. Not long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, but the quality of it was different from the pauses in a normal conversation. It had a different texture. "What records?" she said. "All of it, Amber. 16 months. I added it up." Another pause. "I know what the total is," I said. "I know about the property in Pampanga. I checked the address." I stopped. I'd intended to say more. I'd planned what I was going to say. But in the moment, I found I didn't want to say, More. I just wanted to hear what she said next. What she said next was, Jasper, you need to calm down. You're making this sound much worse than it is. I'd heard that phrase before, not from Amber, from Caroline in almost exactly those words during the conversation in our kitchen in Didsbury when I'd first raised the financial discrepancies I'd found. You're making this sound much worse than it is. It's a specific phrase. It does a specific thing. It relocates the problem from the facts to your perception of the facts. It suggests that the issue isn't what happened, but how you're describing it. How much worse is it than it sounds? I asked. She began to explain. The property situation was a misunderstanding. The agent had used the wrong photographs. The actual property was a different one. She had all the documentation and would show me. The money for her brother was still accounted for. She had receipts. She could bring everything together. The car was shared use, and she'd assumed I understood that. She spoke quickly and with the smooth fluency of someone who has thought through this possibility and has answers prepared. I listened to all of it. Amber, I said when she finished, this is the third time. She went quiet. I've been through this twice before, I said. Different women, different details, same thing underneath. I know exactly what this is because I've lived through it twice, and I should have seen it this time, and I didn't. I paused. That's not an accusation. I mean, it is, obviously, it's an accusation, but it's also something I have to say out loud because I've never said it out loud before to anyone. I've never actually admitted, even to myself, that this is a pattern, that I do this, that I find a way to let this happen every time. She said nothing for a long moment. I think, she said finally carefully, that you should talk to someone, a counselor or someone, because I think you're dealing with something from your past that has nothing to do with me, and you're projecting it onto. I'm not projecting anything, I said. I kept my voice level. The property address was wrong. The money is gone. Those are facts, not projections. She began again, a different angle, a softer tone, the particular warmth she could turn on with the ease of someone who has spent years perfecting the setting. I let her talk. Then I said goodbye and I hung up. I sat in the quiet again. I thought about Gemma. I thought about the fact that I would need to call her and tell her what I'd found, and that she would handle it with the same measured, non-triumphant restraint she always used when she turned out to be right about something important. I thought about the two divorce solicitors I'd sat across from, in Manchester, in 2 different years, in 2 different offices, with the same gray carpet energy. And then I thought about myself, not in the way I usually think about myself, with the edits in, the generous interpretations, the explanations that make me sound reasonable, even when I wasn't. I thought about myself plainly. I am a man who is attracted to competent women. I am a man who responds to self-reliance with trust. I am a man who needs, in some deep and apparently ineradicable way, to feel necessary to be the person who helps, who provides, who is depended on. And that need, which sounds almost noble when you describe it that way, is the specific vulnerability that 3 different women in 3 different countries, in 3 different decades of my life, had found and used. They hadn't manufactured the vulnerability. It was already there. They simply found it and understood what it was worth to them. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. Not the money, not even the betrayal. It's the recognition that the mechanism was mine, the lock was mine. They just found the right key. I called Gemma that evening. Manchester time, mid-afternoon for her, she answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "How did it go?" she said. "About how you'd expect," I said. I told her the property situation. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you want me to come out?" "No," I said. "Thank you. I need to sit with this on my own for a bit. Are you all right?" I thought about that, honestly. "I'm not angry," I said. "I think that's the strangest part. I'm not even particularly surprised, if I'm truthful. I think I'm just very tired of not knowing myself well enough to protect myself from myself." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she uses when she is saying something difficult because it needs to be said, "Dad, I've watched you do this your whole life. You're the most capable person in a room, right the way up until someone needs you. Then you stop seeing clearly. It's not stupidity. It's what you do." "I know," I said. "So what are you going to do about it?" I didn't have an answer that evening, but I've been working on one since. I reported the situation to the relevant authorities here, not because I had significant expectations of financial recovery. The money had moved too many times and too quickly for recovery to be realistic, but because it seemed right to do so, and because Addie Buenaventura, the Philly attorney my daughter's husband found through an expat legal network, told me that reporting was important regardless of outcome. He is a small, serious man who speaks English with the precision of someone who learned it academically, and he does not waste words, which I respect. He filed the appropriate complaints. The process is ongoing and slow, and I don't attach my sense of resolution to it. I found a counselor through an expat mental health resource, Gemma, located online. His name is Dr. Fanasir. He practices in Quezon City, and he has a way of asking questions that sounds like a casual conversation until you realize you've answered something you'd been avoiding for 40 years. I've been seeing him weekly since November. He doesn't think I'm irredeemable, which I appreciate, though I've told him I'm not sure I agree. We're working on that disagreement. What I've understood through those sessions, imperfectly, partially, the way you understand things when you're 75, and some of the wiring has been in place for a long time, is this. The quality I call competence in women, the thing that draws me in and makes me trust immediately, is something I respond to because it mirrors what I want to believe about myself. A capable woman reflects back a version of me as someone worth her time, someone equal to her capability. I find that profoundly reassuring in a way I've never examined closely. And the corollary, the need to be needed, to be the provider, the helper, the one who makes things easier, is the same coin, other side. It makes me feel useful in a way that pure romantic attention doesn't. I'm not moved by being desired. I'm moved by being necessary. 3 women across 3 decades found that particular combination of mirrors and exploited it with varying levels of sophistication. Amber was the most sophisticated. She was also operating in a context, a foreign country, a man separated from his normal support networks, a social environment where financial disparity is visible and expected, that gave her structural advantages the others hadn't had. The Philippines didn't create the pattern, but it gave the pattern ideal conditions. I'm still here in the flat in Quezon City. People ask me why I haven't gone back to Manchester, and the answer is the same one I keep coming back to. There is nothing specific pulling me back, and leaving would feel like running from something rather than moving towards something, and I've spent enough of my life running from things while telling myself I was moving toward them. I'd rather stay put and actually look at the thing this time. I've been spending more time with a group of expats who meet on Tuesday evenings at a bar near the Cubao area. They found each other the way expats find each other here, through forums and word of mouth, and the shared necessity of having people around who understand the specific texture of life as a foreigner in a city that is magnificent and bewildering in equal measure. There's a Canadian named Brent who has been here 14 years and knows the bus routes better than most locals and talks about Philippine history with the enthusiasm of a man who fell in love with a place and never quite got over it. There's an Australian woman named Rosalind who moved here after her own complicated divorce and runs an online editing business and has opinions about everything delivered with a directness I find genuinely refreshing after years of managing around things rather than saying them. Neither of them knows the full story. They know enough, the broad outline, that things went badly, that money was involved. They haven't pushed for more than I've offered. I'm grateful for that too. Gemma flew out in December. I didn't ask her to, and I'm glad she didn't ask my permission because I might have said it wasn't necessary, which would have been wrong. She stayed for 10 days. We went to the market near the flat, and she negotiated more aggressively than any Filipino vendor I'd encountered, and came away with a set of table linens that she declared excellent value. We had dinner 3 evenings running at the same restaurant around the corner because she liked the food and I liked the habit of it. On the last night she said, "I'm not going to say I told you so. You already said it." Essentially on the phone in October. "That was a question," she said. "It doesn't count." "It counted," I said, "and it was the right question." She looked at me for a moment. "You seem, I don't know, more like yourself, actually, than you have in a while." "I've been thinking more clearly," I said, "which sounds strange given the circumstances." "Does it?" "Maybe not," I said. "There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from having no comfortable story left to tell yourself. I'd spent decades in the warm fog of my own self-justifications, the versions of events that made me the reasonable one, the one who'd tried hard, the one who'd been let down by bad luck or worse choices in partners. And those versions weren't entirely false, but they were incomplete in a specific way. They left out the parts where I'd chosen not to see what was in front of me, where I'd had enough information to make a different decision and made the same one anyway because the alternative was uncomfortable. 3 times in 3 different decades. There's no comfortable story I can tell about that. And the absence of it, the absence of the excuse, is clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. It doesn't feel good exactly, but it feels true. And at 75, I have decided that I would rather have the truth than the comfort, even when the truth is specifically about my own failures. I lost $430,000. I'm not going to pretend that number is easy to carry. It represents a significant portion of what I accumulated over a working life of considerable effort and some personal cost. I'll manage. The pension is intact. The flat here is affordable. I'm not going to be destitute, and I'm aware that awareness is itself a privilege not everyone in my position would have. But the money matters, and I'm not going to make it symbolic of something larger in a way that lets me avoid the fact that it was real money, earned over real years, and it's gone. What I'm doing differently, or trying to do differently, Dr. Financier would tell me to use cautious language, is paying attention to the mechanism. Not to women in general, not to Filipinos specifically, not to any category of person that would let me treat my experience as someone else's problem rather than mine. paying attention to the mechanism in myself, the thing that responds to competence with immediate trust, the thing that needs to be needed so badly that it stops asking questions, the thing that sees what it doesn't want to see and looks away before the image fully forms. I can't dismantle it. It's been in place too long, and it's too deeply wired into who I am. But I can notice it now in a way I couldn't or didn't before. I can feel it activating, the warmth, the recognition, the pull towards someone who seems self-sufficient but could use my help, and I can pause. I can ask the question underneath the feeling. I can add up the numbers before they've been running for 16 months. That's not a cure. It's a practice. I'm not sure at 75 that I have enough time left to turn a practice into a habit, but it's what I've got. And I find, to my mild surprise, that working with what you've got, honestly and without the comfortable story, is something I can actually do. My father had a phrase he used when he wanted to say that a situation was what it was and further complaint was pointless. He'd say, "You've made your bed, lad. Now have a rest in it." I always thought that was a bit grim. I understand it better now, not as resignation, as acceptance. These are the circumstances. I made choices that contributed to them. The choices are made. What remains is what I do from here. I'm still getting up in the mornings, still drinking bad coffee from the corner shop because I haven't found a good local roaster yet, and I've stopped asking Brent for recommendations because his idea of good coffee and mine are not reconcilable. Still going to see Dr. Fonasier on Thursdays. Still turning up to the Tuesday evening group and listening to Rosalind argue about things with the cheerful aggression of someone who has stopped caring whether people agree with her. Amber is still out there somewhere in this city. We share the same general postcode. Statistically speaking, I don't think about it much. I thought about it a great deal in the early weeks and found it unproductive. She made choices that were hers to make and will answer for them in whatever way she answers for them. What she did, and I want to be clear about this, because I notice a tendency in myself to find the kind language and use it. What she did was deliberate and systematic, and it cost me something significant. The fact that I understand my own role in it doesn't change what hers was. Both things are true at the same time. I've been writing some of this down. Not this story exactly, but notes, observations, the kind of thing that used to seem self-indulgent and now seems necessary. Dr. Fonasier suggested it as a way of making the invisible visible, turning the feelings into objects you can examine rather than whether you live inside. He's right. It's useful. I wish I'd started doing it 40 years ago, in which case I might have had some of these thoughts written down where I could look at them before I made the same mistake in 3 different decades. But I didn't do it 40 years ago. I'm doing it now at 75. With what's left, that's not the ending anyone wants for a man who has worked hard and lost a great deal and is sitting in a flat in Quezon City trying to understand himself. People want the recovery, the triumphant late chapter, the moment where everything that was taken is given back with interest. I don't have that. What I have is a man who has finally, at the 3rd attempt, looked directly at his own pattern without blinking and discovered that the looking, even when it's painful, is better than the alternative. Maybe that's enough. Maybe at this point in life, that's exactly enough. There's something I haven't said clearly enough, and I think I need to say it before this is done. Gemma called me again 2 weeks after she left. Saturday morning, Manila time, which meant she was still in her dressing gown in Leeds. She said, "I've been thinking about something since I got back. Can I ask you something personal?" "You've never asked permission before," I said. "This is more personal than usual." "Go on then." "Did you know?" she said. "Not about Amber specifically, but did some part of you know from early on that things weren't what they seemed? And just not say anything to yourself." I sat with that question for a long time before I answered. A minute, maybe more. She waited. "Yes," I said. "I think so. Not consciously, not in a way I could have written down. But there's a thing that happens. I've noticed it now, looking back, where information comes in and I just don't fully process it. Like a filter. The information I want goes through, and the information I don't want gets held at the edge, half registered, half ignored. I know it's there. I just don't let it be fully real yet." "What does that feel like?" she asked. "When you're in it." "It feels like optimism," I said. "It feels like giving someone the benefit of the doubt. It feels like not being suspicious of someone just because you've been hurt before." I paused. "It feels exactly like the right thing to do. That's why it's so hard to see." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that's the most honest thing you've ever said to me about any of this. I'm running out of the energy to be anything else," I said. And I meant it without self-pity. I meant it as a simple fact, which is the only useful way to mean things at this point. The honest version of my 3 marriages. And I'm using the word loosely because Amber and I were never married, though we were together long enough that the distinction sometimes feels academic, is this: I chose women who understood what I needed before I understood it myself. That's not a coincidence. That's a type. The women who were drawn to what I offered were women who were very good at reading what someone needed and becoming that thing. And I was very good at needing things without admitting I needed them, which made me apparently a legible kind of target. I was legible. That's the word I keep coming back to. My needs were readable. My vulnerabilities were visible if you knew how to look. And I had spent 7 decades convincing myself that because I couldn't see them clearly myself, nobody else could see them either. That was wrong. The right people could see exactly what was there, and the right people in this context were the wrong people. Dr. Financier has a phrase he uses when I circle back to the self-blame, which I do regularly, in the way of a man who knows a thought is unproductive but keeps having it anyway. He says, understanding your role is not the same as accepting full responsibility for someone else's choices. I've written that down. I've read it back on difficult mornings. It helps, partially, unevenly, which is how things help when the wound is still fresh enough to notice. Because what I have to hold simultaneously is this: Amber made deliberate choices that were wrong and harmful, and she should answer for them. And I made choices that were unexamined and self-deceiving, and I have to answer for those too. Both sets of choices happened. They are not the same thing, but they both contributed to the outcome, and pretending otherwise in either direction would be dishonest in a way I can no longer afford. Brent said something at a Tuesday evening session that stayed with me. We weren't talking about my situation specifically. Brent talks about the city mostly, the politics, the history, the food. But he said about something else entirely. The thing about living somewhere that isn't your home country is that you can't use the familiar patterns as a map. You have to actually look where you're going, because the roads you know don't exist here. He was talking about navigating transport, literally, but I wrote it down in my notebook that night and read it back the next morning and thought, yes, that's it exactly. Except that I'd brought my familiar patterns with me in my luggage and used them anyway, and ignored the fact that the roads were different. I'd brought Sandra and Caroline with me to Manila. Not literally, obviously, but the behavioral habits developed in relation to them. The ways I'd learned to ignore certain signals, the comfort with certain dynamics, the specific blindnesses I'd cultivated in order to stay in relationships I should have left sooner. I'd carried all of that 10,000 kilometers and applied it with perfect fidelity to a completely new context. I'd been so proud of myself for starting over. I'd moved countries, changed climates, altered everything that was externally visible about my life. And then I'd reconstructed the same pattern in a new setting in under 4 months, which might actually be a personal record. The specific thing I'm working on in the sessions with Dr. Fanasier is what he calls the pause between signal and response. There is a moment, very brief, almost imperceptible, between when information registers and when I decide what to do with it. In that moment, I have historically been very fast at sorting information into 2 categories: things I'm comfortable receiving and things I'm not. The things I'm not comfortable receiving get sent to the holding area, the half-acknowledged zone, where they sit and accumulate and don't fully become real until they're unavoidable. What he's helping me do is slow that moment down, make the sorting process visible to myself. Ask before I file something in the comfortable category: is this actually comfortable? Or is this comfortable seeming? Is this actually a reasonable explanation? Or is this an explanation I prefer? It sounds simple. It is not simple. It is the hardest thing I have ever tried to do. And I say that as a man who built a business from nothing in an industry with significant margins and difficult partners and spent 4 decades holding it together through recessions and restructures and the particular grind of responsible management. That was hard work. This is harder because the resistance isn't external. The resistance is me. I'm going to be honest about the money one more time because I think I've been careful around it, and I shouldn't be. $430,000 is a life-changing amount to lose. Not life-ending. I am not in genuine hardship. I want to be clear about that. But life-changing in the sense that the life I had planned for the final years is now structured around different constraints. The comfortable cushion is thinner. The sense of security that came from having sufficient reserves is reduced. I notice that reduction on certain days more than others. On days when something breaks and needs replacing, or when Gemma mentions wanting to bring the grandchildren to visit and I start calculating. Those days are harder than the others, but I've stopped punishing myself for the money specifically. What I've learned, finally, through a process that took 3 marriages and 75 years, and a flat in Quezon City, and a counselor who asks the right questions too, quietly for me to dodge them, is that the money was always downstream of the pattern. If I hadn't lost it to Amber, I might well have lost it to someone else. The money was the expression of the problem, not the problem itself. Fix the problem, or at least see the problem clearly enough to manage it, and the money, whatever's left of it, is safer. That's the only version of a happy ending I can honestly offer. Not justice, not recovery, not a triumphant late chapter where I get back what was taken. Just a man who is finally, at the 3rd attempt, stopped lying to himself about what he does and why. Who has started to learn the shape of his own vulnerabilities in time to possibly, maybe, no guarantees, do something different the next time. Whether there is a next time, I genuinely don't know. I'm 75. I'm not looking. I'm not trying. But I know myself well enough now to know that not looking and not being at risk are different things. So I keep the notebook. I keep seeing Dr. Fonasier. I keep showing up to the Tuesday evenings and listening to Brent talk about jeepney routes and Rosalind argue about whatever Rosalind is currently arguing about, because being around people who are exactly what they appear to be, who don't want anything from me that they haven't said they want, is a practice in its own right. It reminds me what that feels like so that I can recognize it, so that when something feels different, I notice. I've made my bed, I'm in it, and for the first time in a very long time, I'm actually resting in it, rather than lying awake wondering which version of events is true. That's new. That's something. It'll have to do. One more thing, because Gemma asked me last week whether I'd ever write any of this down properly, and I told her I was thinking about it, and she said, "Don't think about it, Dad, just do it. You always think about things so long they stop being true." She's right about that. She's been right about most things related to me for the better part of 30 years, and I've been slow to fully acknowledge it, which is its own kind of pattern. So here it is, written down, the shape of what happened and the shape of what I did that allowed it to happen, and the shape of what I'm attempting at this late point in the proceedings to do differently. If you're a man reading this from a similar position, retired, somewhat alone, considering a move somewhere warm and unfamiliar, telling yourself you've learned from your past, I'm not going to tell you not to go. I'm not going to tell you to distrust everyone you meet or to treat warmth as a threat or to live inside suspicion. That's not a life. And the Philippines, for all that happened to me here, is a remarkable place. I mean that without performance. The people are extraordinary, and the food is extraordinary, and the light in the mornings does something to the sky that I have never seen anywhere else and that I still stop to look at even now, even on the difficult days. What I'm going to tell you is, know your pattern, not in the abstract. Every man thinks he knows his weaknesses in the abstract. It costs nothing to know them in the abstract. Know them specifically. Know what they feel like from the inside when they're activating. Know what the comfortable story sounds like in your own voice, because it always sounds reasonable and it always has a good explanation for why this time is different. It might be different. Probably it isn't. But go carefully. Add up the numbers. Listen to your daughter. And if you're a man who, like me, has already been through this exact experience before, maybe once, maybe twice, and you're still reading, I understand. I understand the specific quality of humiliation involved in recognizing that you have done the same thing again. I understand the temptation to blame the country, or the woman, or the circumstances, or the particular set of factors that made this situation technically different from the previous one. I understand because I've spent decades being very good at all of those things. The harder path is the one that leads back to yourself, to the specific, observable habits and needs and blindnesses that you brought into every room and every relationship and every financial decision, to the pattern underneath the individual incidents. I didn't take that path until I was 75 and had lost $430,000 across 16 months in Quezon City. That's an expensive education. I'd have preferred a cheaper one. But it's what I've got, and I'm using it. I'm still here. In this flat, with the fan running and the street outside doing what it does, which is everything at once, at full volume with no apology for the noise. I make my tea, I write in the notebook, I go to see Dr. Fanatier on Thursdays. I show up on Tuesday evenings and let Rosalind argue at me and let Brent talk about routes I'll never use. And I am present in a way that I haven't been honestly in a very long time. Not happy exactly, not yet, but present and clear-eyed. 3 divorces worth of clarity, about 40 years too late, better than never, just barely, but better. There is a version of this story I kept wanting to tell, and I've been resisting it because it's the comfortable version, and I've promised myself I'd stop leading with the comfortable version. The comfortable version has Amber as the villain and me as the victim, and the whole thing as something that happened to me from the outside. That version isn't wrong, exactly. What she did was wrong. The financial exploitation was real and deliberate, and I didn't deserve it. But it's incomplete in a way that lets me off too easily. And I've spent too many years letting myself off too easily. The version I've been telling in these pages is harder. It requires me to sit with the fact that I have a long documented history of making similar choices in similar emotional states, and that history is mine, not anyone else's. And it traveled with me from Manchester to Manila with everything else in my luggage. It requires me to acknowledge that the pattern was visible, has always been visible to anyone looking from outside it, and that my daughter has been watching it since she was 15 and has never quite known how to say what she was seeing without me dismissing it. It requires me to look at the long catalog of comfortable explanations I have deployed across 3 relationships to avoid the one uncomfortable truth at the center of all of them. The uncomfortable truth is this: I am, at a deep level, afraid of genuine solitude, not the surface kind of solitude. I've lived alone for years at a stretch, and I've been fine. But the deeper kind, the kind where you accept that there is no one coming to need you, no one whose life you will make materially easier, no one for whom your resources and your attention and your willingness to help will be the thing that holds their situation together. The kind where you are simply yourself, full stop, not defined by your usefulness to another person. That kind of solitude frightens me in a way I have never, until very recently, been willing to look at directly. And that fear, quiet, constant, always present underneath the practical efficiency and the management habits and the tidy apartment in Quezon City, is what has been running the show for a very long time. 3 women found it, found the fear, and they were clever enough, each in their own way, to position themselves as the solution, to make me feel that my resources and my attention and my willingness to provide were not just wanted but genuinely needed. And that feeling, the feeling of being necessary, was enough to override every flag, every signal, every reasonable question I might otherwise have asked. I understand this now in a way I didn't understand it 6 months ago. Understanding it doesn't make it go away, but naming a thing is the first step in working with it rather than being run by it. Dr. Fanatier would say that. He has said it in various phrasings across several Thursday sessions. The first time he said something like it, I wrote it in my notebook as a reminder. The subsequent times he's said variations of it, I've understood it more deeply each time, the way you understand a piece of music more fully on the 5th listening than on the 1st. I am afraid of being unnecessary. I am drawn to situations that let me be necessary. I have spent money in 3 relationships across 3 decades, purchasing the feeling of being needed, and called it love, and called it helping, and called it generosity, and not one of those words was false, but none of them was the whole truth either. The whole truth, as far as I've been able to excavate it so far, is that I was always partly purchasing something for myself, the feeling of mattering, the sense that without my presence and my resources, something would be harder for someone I cared about. That need was real and deep, and I fed it for 40 years without ever naming it clearly enough to examine it. Amber didn't manufacture that need. She found it already fully formed. She may well have recognized it faster than I ever recognized it in myself, which is a strange kind of respect I extend to her understanding of people, even as I hold her fully accountable for what she chose to do with that understanding. Both things are true. They sit in the same space in my mind now without canceling each other out. Gemma called yesterday. Nothing specific, just checking in, which she does more often now than she used to. She asked how the writing was going. I said I thought I was nearly done with this particular thing. She asked if it felt better having written it down. It feels true, I said, which is different from better but more useful. That sounds like something Dr. Fonasier said, she said. Probably is, I said. I steal his good lines. She laughed, which is not something that comes easily in the context of this subject. And for a moment, I just sat there in the flat with my daughter, laughing on the phone, and the city doing its thing outside, and the tea cooling on the table in front of me. And I thought, this is what remaining looks like. Not triumph, not recovery in the dramatic sense, not the life I'd planned or the finances I'd expected or the relationship I thought I'd found. Just this, a phone call, a cooling cup of tea, the willingness to keep going and to look clearly at the road ahead even when the looking is uncomfortable. It's enough. It has to be enough. And on most days, with some effort and some deliberate attention, I find that it actually is. There's a view from the window of my flat that I've been ignoring for 16 months because I was always looking at something else. At my phone, at Amber, at whatever task was in front of me that felt more urgent than the simple act of looking out a window. I started looking at it properly about 3 weeks after things fell apart. The street below is a minor one, nothing remarkable, a row of small shops and a pharmacy and a bakery that opens very early, and a tricycle stop that's busy at the hours that tricycle stops are busy. Completely ordinary. But at a certain point in the early evening, when the light changes and hits the buildings at an angle that doesn't last long, the whole thing becomes briefly, unexpectedly beautiful in a way that I can't fully explain and haven't tried to. I don't know how many evenings I have left in which to watch that light change. Not a morbid thought, just an accurate one. I'm 75. The evenings ahead are not infinite, and I have spent an embarrassing portion of the ones that are already behind me looking at the wrong things. Comfortable things, easy things, things that kept me from having to look at myself. I'm looking at the view now. I'm adding up the numbers. I'm listening when my daughter asks me the hard questions. That's the whole of it. That's everything I've got left to say. It'll have to be enough, and it is.